Good morning, everybody. Welcome to Law and Crime. I'm Jesse Weber, joined here by trial attorney Brad Micklin, and we're excited to present to you here on the network the most interesting live trials and legal stories in the news today. And today we have an exciting day, so let's talk about it right now. We are going to be live in Ohio in the conclusion of the Claudia Hoerig saga. Do you remember we covered the trial of this woman? So she was charged with murdering her husband, Air Force Reserve Major Carl Hoerig, back in March of 2007. She then fled to her native Brazil, where she remained for 10 years until she was finally extradited back to the United States to face trial. She was found guilty of aggravated murder by a jury of her peers after an incredible time of her on the stand, which we'll talk about a little bit later on. And now begins her sentencing phase. And what we have learned is that based upon an agreement between the United States and Brazil, prosecutors will most likely recommend life in prison with parole eligibility after 28 years. We're going to talk about how that breaks down. And again, we expect the live feed in that courtroom at around 10 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, but if something should happen, we'll make sure to let you know. Right now, our focus, though, is going to be on the Claudia Hoerig case. We expect to be live there again at 10 a.m. for the sentencing. But before we even get there, let's go back to her trial. And really, where's the most appropriate place that we want to start? I know where I want to start, and that's where we're going to start. When Claudia Hoerig, the defendant herself, took the stand. Take a look.
And you agree at this point that Carl Hoerig cannot come in here and explain any of these situations that you testified to, correct?
Yes, he can through the voice recordings.
No, he can't. He can get on this witness stand.
Is he testifying? Don't testify, Mr. Weber. Go ahead.
Well, can Carl Hoerig come in this courtroom and testify?
No.
Okay, thank you. Can Carl Hoerig come in this courtroom and dispute or admit or deny anything you've said to this detective or to this court yesterday?
Okay, let's talk about when Claudia Hoerig took the stand. Brad, that was something to watch. Okay, we see a lot of defendants take the stand, and they always do differently. Do you think that she had a misconception about how our judicial system works and what she can say and what she can't say?
I think so. I think it was a mistake for her to even take the stand in the first place. It's never a good idea, especially with a case that seemed so very clear on its facts that she would do no good by testifying for herself.
But what was the idea? I mean, she was very vocal about a lot in this case, and she even at one point said she can't get a fair trial in the United States because this isn't Brazil. Now, it's her choice to take the stand, so if you're her defense attorney, what do you tell her?
I would tell her not to take the stand. You don't have much control over that when a defendant wants to take the stand, and even though this wasn't a death penalty case, the punishment could be so severe that you're put into a weird place if you're her attorney trying to advise her but letting her make the decision, and apparently she was the one who made it.
And do you think ultimately her testifying is what her downfall was?
I don't think so. I think the crime was so heinous to begin with, I don't think her testifying was going to affect it at all.
I want to talk more about that. Let's play more of Claudia Hoerig when they talk about her behavior after the shooting. Take a look.
A few days before you bought the 357 on March 10th, may have been March 7th, 8th, 9th, I don't know, you transferred $9,900 to Brazil. Is that correct?
I bought the gun.
Yes or no?
No, that's not correct.
Okay. Did you transfer $9,900 to Brazil before you killed Carl Hoerig?
Yes.
Okay. On March 10th, that Saturday, 2 days before you shot Carl Hoerig, you went to Slugmasters and bought a 357 handgun, correct?
On Friday. Friday.
Well, March 10th.
Was it Friday? What?
Well, I'm not going to get into an argument about whether it was Friday or Saturday. March 10th was, according to my calendar, a Saturday. If you want to call it as Friday, that's fine. But on March 10th, which was 2 days before you shot him, you bought a 357.
I'm not sure if it was the 10th or the 9th. Yes, I did buy it before I shot him, of course.
Well, may I approach the witness and refresh her memory with the purchase that she made?
And Brad, that's really where, correct me if I'm wrong, they're trying to establish that this was planned out. This wasn't a spur-of-the-moment killing like she had said. But the fact that she's transferring the money, buying the gun, this is not a garden variety, involuntary manslaughter case or something like that.
Right. She was trying to pretend like she was sending the money to her family because she wanted them to have it. But the timing just doesn't work out to support that.
Now let's talk about the sentence, okay? That's what we're waiting for. We're waiting to be live in the sentencing and see what ultimately happens. Here's the question. Apparently the prosecution entered into some sort of agreement with Brazil where they would recommend life in prison, but with the possibility of parole after 28 years. How'd they come to that?
Well, there was a lot of negotiations with Brazil before the extradition, and they were very strong in that they wanted to make sure that, one, it wasn't going to be a death penalty, and two, that she would get parole. But my understanding was that the prosecutors really said, and in most cases, a prosecutor can't ever make any kind of guarantee other than to say that they're going to be fair and that the judge is impartial. So they weren't really able to establish an exact number, is my understanding.
And the 3 years is mandatory for firearm specifications. So the idea was, we're going to give you parole after 25, but add those 3 years because that's mandatory because of the firearm. But isn't it something in Brazil, if she were charged in Brazil and found guilty, she couldn't serve more than 30 years? I read that maybe that was an agreement that since she's, that was the agreement with Brazil in order to be extradited, that she couldn't serve more, like she couldn't serve life in prison without parole.
Right, I think that's the case. And I think they also wanted to make sure that she was given time or credit for the time served also.
Right, and this doesn't really happen. We haven't seen a case quite like this with extradition from Brazil. Let's take a quick break. When we come back, we're going to play you more of Claudia Hoerig on the stand. Stay tuned. Brad, she testified for over 3 hours talking about this emotional abuse, according to her, that she suffered miscarriages. Would this ever have worked as an effective defense against shooting a man, the fact that she had been suffering for years, according to her?
In some cases it would. I mean, everybody reacts to domestic violence different, and the heat of passion defense, which is what she was trying to use, doesn't have to be in the moment. It can be after long-standing abuse.
But not even physical abuse. Emotional, mental abuse, that's enough to trigger a defense?
It can be. I mean, emotional abuse can be just as damaging, sometimes even more damaging than physical abuse, because it's not noticeable. It can be ongoing. You don't see many people that can notice it when you leave your house, so you're almost always on your own. So it is a good defense in many cases. I just don't think it was here.
Well, I'm going to tell you what one of the jurors said about that in a minute. Let's keep playing Claudia Hoerig's testimony. This was her under cross-examination.
After we got married, he never hinted to me that he had any sexual issue or fetish. Is that called fetish? Fetish. I cannot say that word. Do you know what I mean?
Yes.
I never noticed before we got married. What I know is that he was very nervous about his penis. He had a lump in the middle of his penis that he said some woman, when he was deployed, he went to Germany. She sat on his penis. She broke it. He has this lump, and that turned into cancer. He was freaking out about having cancer, and he was freaking out about not performing. He asked me if I was going to leave him. I said, no, I know that a lot of men have sexual issues because they get nervous and they cannot perform. I didn't see anything wrong with that. I didn't see it coming. I didn't think anything of it.
As this went on and all of this went on, again, why didn't you leave?
I never know what to expect when a defendant testifies, Brad, but I don't think I ever expected her to actually say this. And then the prosecutor made a good point. Again, that was direct examination, but under cross said, he's not here to defend himself, Carl Hoerig. He's not here. He can't even fight any of these accusations of abuse. And that's something I think the jury held on to.
Yeah, it's always problematic when you're a defendant testifying, but you're really saying that the victim was such a bad person that it can often look to the jury like you're just trying to stamp on a man's grave. And it often plays against the person, especially in a case like this where she testifies so poorly.
After the verdict came down, one of the jurors said, in terms of Claudia's alleged abuse, they understood that, but you should never kill someone. Get a divorce. There's no reason to kill him. And they also said about that idea that she bought the gun to commit suicide. One of the factors that really held on for them was, if that's the case, Why did you need a laser sight on the gun?
Right. There's no way to justify her actions. I mean, you could get around that $9,000 transfer and say maybe she did want her mother and family to have the money, but she bought a rifle or a gun with a scope. That's just for aiming practice and for certainty. She wasn't going to commit suicide, and there's no way she could have defended it.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting to hear nonetheless, and what we're going to do is, again, we're keeping a careful eye on the courtroom feed. We expect to be live in that courtroom during sentencing for, maybe in another half hour or so, but we're going to continue to talk about this case. So stay tuned here on Law and Crime. We'll be right back.
In Newton Falls, he lived in a nice 3-story split up the jury went through. The scene will become important. And they had lived there together. She was a native of Brazil, became an American citizen. She had been married for 10 years to a doctor in New York. She divorced him and didn't kill him.
Objection, sustained, disregard that last statement.
That little part there I want to talk about, Brad. I mean, the emotions from the prosecution could really be felt. They almost like they had a stake in this. I mean, this was something that was occurring since 2007, and that idea that she had lived with somebody else, but she didn't kill him. And then the fiery cross-examination with Claudia Hoerig. It's hard not, as being a prosecutor, to not have some emotion in this. Correct?
Yeah, you could tell he was tied. And this victim, unfortunately, spent his life risking his life for everybody else, for our country, and to be taken down in such a horrible way, I think it really hit home for the prosecutor, because you could tell he was really invested in it.
Do you think we're going to see some of that emotion today during the sentencing phase?
I don't think so. I think he's going to take more of a calm approach, more of a methodical approach to ensure that she gets the maximum.
Because the hard part's over, convicting her. Let's keep going with the prosecution's opening statement, again, detailing why this is not anything like the defense will articulate. This is some sort of involuntary manslaughter, or that she just snapped, how this was planned out, and it was aggravated murder. Take a look.
We have this man preparing to end a marriage, to leave the house and let her live in the house after less than 2 years of marriage on that weekend. While he's preparing to leave her, she's preparing to kill him that weekend. So he's out flying, doing his job. He's got $100 down, as will show. And on Saturday, she goes and purchases a Smith & Wesson .357, 5-shot. And Mr. Becker will introduce a witness.
So, Brad, the prosecution's detailing a case of aggravated murder that was planned out. She bought the gun. She was sending money off to Brazil. If you were her defense attorney, would there be a different avenue to explore than the one they had, which was mostly just putting her on the stand to explain these years of emotional and mental abuse she suffered or allegedly suffered? Would you have gone a different route?
I don't think so. I don't think there really is any other route. I mean, it's fortunate or unfortunate, depending on where you are in a case like this, that we are all very exposed to stories of domestic violence and victims of domestic violence. So it's something that people are ready to understand and accept. And absent that, there would have been no justification for that. Now, I don't think the excuse was even a justification, but...
Now, we don't know the full details of the sentencing hearing today, but the defense, do they have the opportunity to bring out witnesses and say, hey, let's talk about who Claudia Hoerig really is and what was going on?
I would believe so. Most jurisdictions will allow you to have some character testimony, some mitigating factors if possible, to try to reduce the sentence or at least increase the likelihood of parole options.
Can the judge take that into consideration?
Yes, sure.
But here with this agreement, this alleged agreement, between the United States and Brazil, that she can't be charged further than life in prison with the possibility of parole after 28 years? Can the judge just say, forget it, life in prison, no parole?
I'm really not sure. I was looking at the agreement. I'm not sure because I believe that the prosecutor indicated that they have no control over what a judge is going to order. So I'm imagining this judge isn't really bound by the agreement, but I'm sure he's going to be influenced by it.
And sometimes the judge comes forward and gives kind of a message to the world at large. We know the cameras are going to be rolling, especially in this case. Do you think the judge will take a moment and speak to this defendant about her actions before handing down the sentence?
I think so. The fact that it's televised, it gives obviously a much broader audience than if it was just in a courtroom. But even in a courtroom with jury present and witnesses and the media, I think a statement would be necessary so that they can sort of educate and not have it happen again.
And maybe a statement that's even different, because this is different than anything we've ever seen, considering she fled to another country. So what would the statement that the judge make, what would it be there? Well,
I would hope that he would address the use or the claim of abuse leading to this. I think he would want to, or should at least try to educate that it's not an appropriate defense, that it can't be used as a catch-all if you have a bad marriage to go and kill somebody. I think that's the message that he would want to communicate, or at least should communicate.
And don't escape to another country and think that you're going to be okay.
Right,
because
the U.S. won't leave you alone.
Exactly, and here it was such a remarkable case that she was extradited back to the United States. We never really see this. Let's take a break, and when we come back, we're going to play you the defense's opening statement from the Claudia Hoerig trial. We'll be right back.
Put on a plane. Flown back to Ohio on the plane voluntarily. Told the marshals her story. Came back here, sat down. You're going to watch. She sat down with the detectives. You're going to watch. She spends a half an hour or so. You're going to see in the video telling them she really doesn't want to talk about what happened. She doesn't want to give them all the information because she doesn't want to hurt Carl's family. She doesn't want to impugn the dead man. That's why the lie is so important in this case. You won't hear any evidence of premeditation, planning, or design.
Okay, that statement, want to talk about it right there because it became so pivotal in that case. Have you ever seen a case before where one statement, if made, could lead someone to kill another person, and a jury could come back and say, well, they might have been justified, it might have created an impulse reaction? Because here's the idea: you create a person who's so mentally distraught, thought she was going to kill herself, threatened to kill herself, and her husband said, according to her, well, if you're going to do it downstairs so you don't get blood on the artwork. Have you ever seen that actually work?
No. And I guess it is possible if you've brought somebody to the brink, that one sentence would push them over, but that wasn't the case here.
But even if that was the case, correct me if I'm wrong, the ballistics don't quite match up with somebody who shot another person in the heat of the moment, do they, Brad?
No, not at all. I mean, again, she bought the scope, she went to target practice, she shot him in the back when he was trying to either flee or get away from her.
And there's a whole discussion about whether or not he was, at the bottom of the stairs, whether he was at the top of the stairs, whether she chased him, and her theory of how she did it didn't quite make sense. And then under cross-examination, she admits to firing at him one more time when he's already on the ground. I can imagine being her defense attorney and shaking their heads.
Yeah, well, I mean, you're given the facts that you have, you're given the defendant that you have. Sometimes you don't have much you can do with a case like this.
Again, we're waiting for the sentencing, so what are you going to be looking out for today when the sentencing hearing ultimately begins?
I'd be interested to see if there's any mention to the Brazil agreement and how that would impact sentencing, or whether that they're going to just leave it in the judge's discretion.
Again, we do believe that the United States and Brazil have entered into an agreement whereby the prosecution will offer life in prison but with parole eligibility after 28 years. 3 of those 28 years come with mandatory firearm specifications. We are going to talk more about the details of this agreement and what we can expect in the sentencing in a little bit. I'm keeping a careful eye on the courtroom feed, so if it should go live, we will make sure to go live. But what is very interesting is that this is going to be the conclusion of a case that has really captured our attention, and that's a live feed right there. So let's take a quick break. We'll be right back. Stay tuned here on Law and Crime.
She tried to kill herself, pulled the trigger twice. Each time the round didn't go off. At this point, she called her father, spoke to her father, a friend, her father in Brazil, by the way, a friend, and an attorney. And they instructed her that she needed to leave the country because she would certainly be charged with murder and get the death penalty. And that Brazil wouldn't extradite.
Okay, I'm back here with trial attorney Brad Micklin to break this down. Never good when a law enforcement officer talks about the statements made by the defendant. No, it's hard to cross-examine any witness, but this is one of, I think, 2 witnesses who came forward that she made these statements. Never good.
No. And I found myself wondering, and I'm assuming she didn't have her own attorney with her during this travel, which could have made complicated constitutional issues, but it sounded like she just, after a certain amount of time, just started to spill everything out. And, right, they're credible witnesses, so you can't cross-examine them well.
Well, it's like what we talked about earlier. She maybe didn't have an understanding of the United States judicial process.
I think she did, because she fled the country. And
she knew she did something wrong, but maybe she didn't understand that she had a right to an attorney, or that she shouldn't speak to these officers. I mean, she went in open court, in our courtroom, and said she can't get a fair trial here. This isn't Brazil.
But she also said that when she called her father, I think it was the father who told her that there's death penalty in Ohio, get out of the state. So she had to have an idea of how the system works when she took off.
And if this is true, I mean, presumably, because why would these witnesses lie about it? She was probably just trying to get herself off and explain what she did.
Right. Because again, like I said before, she believes it sounds like what she did was justified, was appropriate. So of course she's going to tell her story without fear.
Isn't it amazing that she was extradited back to the United States? You never see this.
No, and it took a long time, I understand. And I can't imagine the resources that we had to commit to something like this. But it's good to know that we do, because we have an interest in protecting our citizens from this kind of.
I want to talk about her extradition, how that law changed, and how the idea that, what was she a citizen of Brazil? Was she a United States citizen? We're going to talk about that in a second. Let's move on, though, to Bill Bolden, who's a U.S. Marshal, another person who was on that plane with her. Listen to what he had to say.
Continued on the lengthy flight. She began to tell her story, a version of events as to what occurred when she was involved or when she shot her husband, Carl Hoerig. I noticed at the time it was approximately 6:52 p.m. when she made that comment. She made a variety of comments that were not in chronological order. She stated that she made a comment that she wanted to commit suicide and she purchased a gun to kill herself.
Okay, you know what's interesting here, and I can't help but think about this. Even if this is all true, and we always try to see if the defendant is not telling the truth, if that story is all true, isn't that still murder?
Oh, without a doubt. And the funny, not the funny thing, but the strange thing, or another aspect to this, is she spent 11 years in Brazil getting ready to come back. She had to know what she was doing. She had to know what she was saying. And to go on and explain it this way, she had to have counsel before it. It's preposterous.
But did she have any idea that she would actually be taken from Brazil back to the United States? She couldn't have known that.
No, but over the course of the 11 years she fought it, she had to come to realize it was a chance, and she had to have legal counsel that whole time, would have been telling her to be prepared, because she was going to be tried in Brazil or here. So she had to be ready for something.
What's interesting is, so she was a Brazilian citizen under the Brazilian Constitution. She couldn't actually be extradited to the United States to face charges, but the United States attorneys here in Ohio were able to convince Brazil, and particularly the Brazilian Supreme Court, that she renounced her citizenship back in 1999 when she became a U.S. citizen. And in 2016, the Brazilian Supreme Court stripped her of her Brazilian citizenship. This doesn't happen, right? This is why it's such a unique case. Have you handled extradition cases quite like this before?
No, I've never seen anything quite like this before. And given the gravity of her offense, it makes sense that they would try to prosecute for so long to have her return, because we can't have people learning that that's an effective tool to use.
Well, what do you think about countries that don't allow extradition?
It's problematic, but it's going to depend on the situation, because the country also has an interest in protecting its own citizens, as well as prosecuting crimes that are committed by its citizens. So there's always a battle between the two states or countries as to who has the greater interest.
But at the same time, you don't want somebody killing somebody in one country, fleeing to their home stands. Hey, it's all okay. So as we wait for the live feed in the sentencing hearing, let's take a quick break, and we'll be right back. as expected, she was sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 28 years. Let's get some perspective right now from Brad Micklin. Brad, the judge seemed to echo a lot of the things that you and I were talking about.
Yeah, I don't think the judge had really any choice here, because if you think it through, if she hadn't fled, she would have faced the possibility of life without parole. So because she fled, lived free for 9 or 10 years, she comes back and gets actually almost a mandatory parole sentence. It would have been grossly unfair for him to do anything less. And
the judge permitted some of the family members who were affected by this killing to speak out, and really just what a nightmare it must be for them, the idea that she lived free for years. And one of them in particular said, I believe it was the brother of Carl Hoerig, that he's going to speak out at her parole hearing in, 28 years and be there to talk about Carl's memory.
Yeah, the speeches were very moving. And if you notice, they focused so much more on her actions after the murder. Obviously, they lost such a tragic member of their family, but that wasn't their focus. It wasn't even about their loss. It was about her actions after, her lack of remorse, her blame of everybody. They were more contemptuous for that conduct, and it seemed to seeking more so than the seeking punishment for the murder.
The judge caught that. The judge says the only time you really had emotion was talking about your own family, which is what we had talked about as well. And according to him, you always wonder if it would have been better to take a bench trial and not a jury, but based upon the judge's comments, he probably would have found her guilty as well.
Well, and look, the one time she chooses not to speak is at sentencing.
Let's talk about that. So she, at the very beginning, her attorneys, you might have missed this, said she doesn't want to say anything today, but she's going to write a letter to the family members of Carl Hoerig and also to the media, saying that she has been mischaracterized and misquoted. But she won't make a statement today. What did you make of that?
Well, that was even worse, because everybody's speech was about how she's not taking responsibility for her own actions, and even her last final speech to the court was, I'm not going to speak because I get misquoted. Again, she's the victim. Her last opportunity to really show some remorse, and instead she blames other people.
Yeah, and she seemed almost defiant in a way, showing no emotion when these victim impact statements were being read.
Right. And even when the sentence was being handed down.
But she also expected that was going to happen. And one of the testaments is to this extradition agreement. The judge really was kind of confined in a way, couldn't sentence her to life in prison without the possibility of parole, but had to sentence her to life in prison, but with parole after 25 years. 25 was one of the minimums, and then you had the 3 years for the firearm specification. So pretty interesting. Brad, let's take a break, and when we come back, we'll obviously have a lot more to talk about. Stay tuned. Welcome back, everybody. We're still reacting to the sentence that was just handed down against Claudia Hoerig. She was just sentenced by the judge to life in prison with the possibility of parole eligibility after 28 years. Exciting day in the courtroom, and I want to play some of the moments that you may have missed. First thing we saw was the statement from the defense attorney. Let's see what he had to say in case you missed it. Brad, what did you make of that statement? Really, they're saying that she should have been given, she should be given the lesser sentence, and the way they do is that they just quickly throw in the idea of mental health and this and that and this and that.
I mean, there's very little they could argue with. I mean, aside from the extradition agreement, she admitted to killing her husband.
Right.
But the worst part, or one of the worst parts, was her speech that was written even was more concerned about the media. She referenced the media several times. Like,
is she talking about us?
Probably. She probably knows that you're interviewing us today. But it showed no concern even for the act, no remorse, nothing at all. It was just the worst I've ever seen in a closing.
Well, what struck me about that was the attorney saying, we recognize that whenever a murder is committed, there's it's such a tragedy. Claudia doesn't, not Ms. Hoerig, and there is that discrepancy. Again, she did not make a statement today.
Right, and she also said, I think, that she plans to address it later, that she's going to address everybody. I guess she wanted to stay quiet, let the sentence come down, and then say whatever she wants.
She was vocal in jail awaiting her trial. She was vocal in the courtroom when she took the stand. She's going to... I mean, I want to read this letter. I really want to read this letter, and when we get it, maybe we'll get a chance to talk about it here on the network. But before we even get there, let's continue on with today when, again, this is now the prosecution providing their statement before sentencing. Prosecution made a little mistake there, not 25 years, 28 years. The judge even had to correct him on that. Were you surprised they didn't provide a bigger statement, which we've seen in sentencings before?
No, because they had provided a memorandum in advance, so the judge had all the information well thought out. I think the prosecutor wanted to let the family go forward, let the judge make its decision, and not draw it out any longer.
Then again, they've been so passionate in this case during the openings, the closing, when they cross-examined her. This was maybe their final attempt to speak on behalf of everybody, on behalf of the state, about what they thought of Claudia Hoerig.
Yeah, perhaps they didn't think they needed it. I think between the agreement and the testimony, that I think they were confident where the case was going to go.
Is there also the fear that let's not even put the family through anymore? You know, let's not even have them have to be in this courtroom with her for 1 second longer than need be.
Yeah, I think that was some of it. I think they wanted to get to the conclusion, let everybody move forward.
And speaking of the family, what we had an opportunity to see, and we weren't sure if we were going to see this, was victim impact statements from family members of Carl Hoerig. Now think about this for a second. This killing happened back in 2007. We are in 2019. That is a long period of time. And they finally have an opportunity to speak to the court and also to Claudia Hoerig about what they really think and how much this has affected them. So let's play right now. This is the brother of Carl Hoerig talking about what happened. How unbelievably selfless can you be? The idea that they want her locked up for the rest of her life. But what does he say? We will respect the idea of this extradition agreement that she could receive parole eligibility in almost 30 years. I mean, that is unbelievable.
Right. And then he goes to say he would support her being paroled at that time if she takes responsibility. I mean, it was an outstanding speech.
He said he's going to be there. And it's never easy making these statements, is it?
No,
I mean, there's so much to think about, and you're talking about 12 years since then.
Right.
So,
I mean,
yeah.
they take their time, and obviously they write it out, but the emotion of the last 12 years has to come flooding back when you start to read it.
And the common theme is that she just never took responsibility.
Right.
That's the biggest thing.
Right. And I think that's what everybody wanted to see at some point, and that's obviously what the brother's going to want to see over the course of the next 28, 30 years.
Our camera was on Claudia Hoerig while these statements were going on. Hard to know what's going on in her mind, especially her mind. Do you get the sense that she still feels like the victim, that she still feels she did nothing wrong?
I think absolutely. I think her refusal to make any statement, even the statement that her attorney read addressing her future conversations to the media and her stoic presence, just all suggests that she still thinks she's the victim.
Is she evil?
She's cold and mouse, yeah. She looks evil.
Now, I don't know if I heard this right. I think we have to rewind the tape. I might have missed it. Did you hear that she maybe got married in Brazil in those 10 years that she was there, living a full life?
Yeah, that's what the brother said. She got married and started a business. She said it looked like she was having a great life over there. And then when she comes back to the U.S., she files a motion to dismiss for lack of speedy trial.
And you mentioned that before, the idea of whether or not she knew she was going to be coming back to the United States. She knew it. She kept fighting it.
Right. For 12 years, she fought it tooth and nail.
Yes, but she's probably shocked that this is her fate.
Because she's the victim.
Now, what happens to her?
And I think they take her off to prison while she appeals it.
And you think she has any chance of a successful appeal?
No, because she admitted it. There's
What
no
would
way
be the
around
grounds?
it. No. Well, there's always, you can make a ground, but there couldn't be any justifiable reason to overturn that.
Brad Micklin, thanks so much for coming on to talk about this really bizarre case.
My pleasure. Thanks.
Yeah, and maybe we'll have you on if that letter comes out where she writes to the media. She'll write about us talking about
Glad
it.
to come back.
We'll definitely talk about it. Brad, thanks for coming on.
Thank you.
We are going to take a break on our end, but when we come back, we have a lot to discuss here on Law and Crime. Again, the Charles Merritt case is dark today, but what evidence and testimony we have to talk about. So stay tuned here on Law and Crime. We'll be right back.